Recently we've looked at creating a realistic fire spreading mechanic, realistic terrain generation, and plant placement using simplex noise. And the goal for this devlog was to add a simple ocean tide mechanic. But I ended up spending an entire 2 weeks fighting shaders trying to make it look at least somewhat realistic. Before I got started on the ocean, I wanted to add a beach first, which actually was pretty easy. I'm already using a wave function collapse approach to generate the grass in the world, and I just did the same thing for the transition from the grass to the beach. If you're interested in the details of wave function collapse, I've actually already got a video over on my main channel that you can check out. But the basic idea is that we can feed this algorithm an example of what we would like generated terrain to look like. It will infer rules from how these tiles are placed in the example, specifically what tiles are allowed to be next to each other, and it will generate more terrain randomly that follows these rules. For example, the input I use for grass looks like this. So each time I refresh my world, it is going to generate a pattern of tiles that looks something like this example set. For my coastline, I just added an example that transitions from grass to sand. I then generated some terrain based on that example and added it in below the existing grass area. Then to make the beach a bit bigger, I just added a section that is just plain sand with no variations. I also had to make some changes to my item system so that items that should only spawn in the bush area don't spawn all over the beach as well. Now it was time to add the ocean to my beach. I've actually experimented previously with using the same wave function collapse approach to generate the ocean. But even if I were to improve the pixel art, I don't really like the rigid coastline it results in. For this game, I wanted the ocean to be a little more free-flowing. The basic idea was to add in a big rectangle and use some combination of tweens and shaders to emulate waves lapping at the shore. To get started, I just had a rectangle with a fragment shader applied to it that would just make it black. Now, I'm not actually all that good with GLSL shaders, so a lot of the rest of this process revolved around me fighting with ChatGPT, trying to get things working. But after some time, I did manage to get the basic wave effect working. It had some issues, but it was a start. Then I decided to try using a vertex shader to manipulate the rectangle into a wave shape, rather than trying to simulate that within a fragment shader. This seemed to be a fundamentally flawed idea though, because my rectangle is a quad made of 2 triangles with just 2 vertices along the top edge where I want the wave effect to be. Manipulating the position of 2 vertices isn't ever going to lead to a convincing and smooth wave effect, as you can see here. It's just kind of slanting one way then the other. I did experiment with using a custom mesh game object instead, so I would have more vertices to work with, but that didn't end up going anywhere. Then I had this, which was the first time it really looked kind of oceany. It sort of gives the effect of the sand slowly fading into the ocean, but this just wasn't feeling right to me. I played with this a lot and ended up with this pixelated ocean effect. This was a bit better, but I still wasn't really feeling it, and I think it just really wasn't fitting with the style of the game. So I started experimenting with a more cartoony pixelated look, and it started to feel like I was onto something. I had this sort of gentle sine wave effect with some froth along the water's edge that would wiggle around a bit. Still not exactly what I wanted, but it felt like I was getting somewhere. Then I tried out an idea I had to tween the wave so that it would flow in and out, or up and down. And I also tried adding multiple waves overlapping each other. Again, I played around a lot and there were many variations, but what I ended up settling on was this. I'm using the properties from the tween to animate the uniforms that are passed into the shader so that as the wave moves, the edge sort of wiggles around rather than remaining completely static. And the froth effect on the water fades in and out. I decided to get rid of the overlapping waves, but I did add this wet sand effect. As the wave reaches its peak, it will create a mark that is then animated to slowly fade away and move down slowly to give the effect of the water absorbing into the sand. I've also added a geometry mask for the player to give the appearance that they are sinking in the water as they get deeper. The mask is just offset based on the Y coordinate of the player and the tide in the game. Right now it's not super convincing because there is no swim animation or particle effects or anything like that. But what is kind of cool is that if the player just stands here as the tide comes in and out, we can see them visually getting shallower or deeper in the water. Anyway, I'm very curious to know what people think about all these variations. Another small but important thing I worked on was to add configurable speed to the player, which is actually harder than it might seem since this game uses pixel art. In a previous video, we talked about sub-pixel rendering issues I ran into with the player's speed while walking on the diagonal. The fundamental issue is that if we want the game to render smoothly, we need to move the character in full integer increments. We can't move the player a portion of a pixel. The problem I had with the player speed is that I would move the player 1 pixel per update. If I am updating the player at 60 frames per second, then it results in the player moving at this speed. But now that I have a beach, I wanted to make it a bit more realistic by having the player move slower on the beach. But as I just mentioned, I can't just move the player, say, half a pixel instead, because it is going to result in jittery movement. So what I did is add this remainders context to the player state machine. I set this to 1, and then I can choose a player speed anywhere from 0 to 1. Each update, the player's speed will be subtracted from the remainders until the remainder hits 0. When the remainders hit 0, I will then move the player 1 pixel. So I still move the player in full pixel increments, I just move the player less often when their speed is slower. This gives me a lot of flexibility over the player speed now, and as you can see here, I can dynamically change the player's speed based on which tile they are currently standing on. I think this provides some interesting trade-offs because the beach will likely be much clearer and easier to navigate through than the bush, but you're also going to move more slowly on the sand. In future, I will also change the player's speed based on whether they are swimming, how much energy they have, whether they are wearing their pack, and probably some other factors. For the next batch of work, I think it's time to focus on the last big structural feature my game needs. We sort of have this semi-complete vertical slice of a section of the game world. And now I need to add some kind of chunk system so that the player can walk infinitely to the east and west. If you want to see how that pans out, feel free to subscribe, and of course if you found this video interesting at all, a like before you go would be very much appreciated.